Well, Don, here we are again, and I have a question for you, and that is there an email leak that could sink Hillary's ship? I'm Dan Perkins.
Well, will tell you what's sinking. It's Obamacare. It had another setback this week and more coming. I'm Don Mazzella.
It's time for Two Guys from Verona. Each week, you will hear from Dan Perkins, a financial expert, a regular columnist for the Hill website, and best-selling author, and Don Mazzella, a veteran journalist, author, and radio host, talking about things that concern you politically, financially, and socially. They will also try to give listeners a heads up on future happenings.
Well, Don, we started the Democratic free-for-all convention this week and started off with major email controversy. It appears that emails just plagued this woman to death.
She just wants convenience.
Whatever. The Democratic National Committee apparently was not playing fair, at least according to 12,000 emails that were released by WikiLeaks on the strategy within the Democratic National Committee, including its national chairman, Debbie, as Rush calls her, Blabbermouth Schultz, in trying to find ways to disrupt Bernie Sanders' campaign in favor of Hillary. And there are some pretty damaging emails. One of them, for example, the chief financial officer of the Democratic National Committee sent an email to the staff asking the question, we've got a close primary in West Virginia and Kentucky, and we know that Mr. Sanders says he's from a Jewish tradition, but we don't really know what his religion is. In fact, I read somewhere, that's a quote, that he might even be an atheist. And if we could get somebody to ask that question in Kentucky and West Virginia, the dutiful Christians might be offended about the idea of considering voting for a Democrat who was an atheist. Forget about the fact that he was a communist, but he's an atheist. And these 12,000 emails are replete with examples of where the Democratic National Committee was manipulating the program in favor of Hillary Clinton. Now, Mrs. Clinton said in an interview last Sunday on 60 Minutes, I had no idea what was going on.
Yes.
I know.
You got a bridge to Brooklyn to sell her, right?
Right. What was that guy that said, I know nothing? Oh, that was Schultz in Hogan's Heroes. I know nothing. She knows nothing. So this morning, I heard the founder of WikiLeaks being interviewed from his somewhat prison in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been for 4 years, afraid to come out because he might be arrested and deported to the United States for criminal activities, whatever that means. Anyway, he was being interviewed, and he believes that they have more emails. That he believed that the release of the emails would be sufficient to indict Mrs. Clinton. So the question becomes, if he has them, when is he going to use them, and to what effect? So I've thought about that today as I was having my eye surgery and beginning to think about it this afternoon. And, I could easily see a situation where they release some of these emails on Thursday morning before Mrs. Clinton has to accept her nomination. But I could also see that they could sit on them for a while, waiting to determine what happens to Mrs. Clinton after the Democratic National Convention and what happens after the first Democratic debate on the 26th of September. It's interesting to me, Don, that the media, which is accused in these 12,000 leaks to being a strange bedfellow with the Democratic National Committee in terms of manipulating and controlling what is being said about Mrs. Clinton and what is being said about Sanders, to the tune that there's an example of where one of the people from the Democratic National Committee called the head of the president of MSNBC, which is not a very big network, but it's a network anyway, expressing his unsatisfaction, his disappointment in the co-host on Morning Joe and her criticism of Mrs. Clinton and her apparent support of Mr. Sanders. We finally have a huge amount of evidence of the great, intriguing partnership between the Democratic Party and the mainstream American news media. We all sort of knew it and believed it, but now we have it on the record in terms of the own language of the Democratic National Committee. It seems to me that what's happening here is that we have functionally, and you may disagree with the description, Don, but functionally we have one element of the news media, WikiLeaks, attacking another element of the news media for their inability to function as real news people. So I think that the WikiLeaks people think that they are distributing information that's important and is part of the news cycle that needs to be communicated to the American public. Don, what do you think?
Well, since the last time we talked, I had very interesting. Let me put this one on. What the head of WikiLeaks really wants is to get out of the Ecuadorian embassy. It can be a very boring place. The food's terrible. So, ever think that this might be a ploy by his part to get a deal done so that he can get out of the embassy?
A deal with who? Obama?
With Obama.
And he's releasing all these emails?
Yeah, but he doesn't reduce the second batch.
Not yet. The question is, as we talked earlier, what we don't know is there a second batch of emails coming from the DNC, or are some of the 30,000 emails that were supposedly wiped off the server hacked by our Guccifer before the Clintons wiped the server and they've got the data?
Well, let's, as a man who believes in justice, I hope that's the case. I really do believe that as it was said to me in the story, the cybersecurity for the CIA said he would not respect any outfit that around the world did not try to hack that server. And apparently it was better known to other people than we've been led to believe. That's the other thing that's probably going to come out, not now, not for a few years, but the fact is that the fact that she had the server was known more widely than we've been told.
And by more people than we've been told who knew about it.
Right.
Including higher people.
Of course. Of course. If you send an email and it doesn't go to the State Department, it doesn't say gov.state or state.gov. You got to start thinking, where's it going?
If you're thinking.
Well, some people have said the Democratic Party right now doesn't have good thinkers.
I agree. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the convention, the Democratic convention so far, later on in the program. So we're coming up to a break. So this is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
We're the two guys from Verona. And remember, if it's important to you, it's important to us. And we'll be.
I want to join you that time.
Okay, and we'll be right back after these messages.
You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
Well, Dan, I guess it's my turn. And I want to talk about something that kind of stayed out of the spotlight for a while, but it's affecting millions of Americans. When the Accountable Care Act passed in a loaded House and Senate vote, the real experts that looked at it said it couldn't work. And you know what? 4 years later, it's not working. President Obama carefully timed everything so that the chickens would come home to roost just as he was leaving the White House. Now, let me give you one or two examples. Number one, to the average person who buys a policy off the exchanges, whether they're state or local, right now is paying 21% more than they did before the Accountable Care Act. 21% on average.
Yeah, but what are they paying in deductibles, Don? Aren't they paying even a huge number for deductibles?
Well, I was going to go into that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And no problem. Plus, the deductible for it on average went from on average of $1,400 to now almost $3,400.
Whoa.
That's the average deductible. These are not my figures, by the way. The other important thing to remember is the average, outside of the fact that there's no penalty for pre-existing conditions, almost all of the policies in general have more restrictions, are less fulfilling than the prior contracts. The other interesting thing is, under ACA, if you had a policy, it could be grandfathered in. And they expected that number would dwindle to nothing by this year. Well, there are 6 million Americans who have policies which they first inaugurated before ACA. 6 million. Now, on average, that should have been less than 2 million in normal times, if you argue that before ACA was normal time. Now, as you know, the insurance companies, the healthcare insurance, all supported ACA, thinking that they had all these millions and millions of people would be forced to come in and buy healthcare policies.
But Don,
well, what happened?
Don, just let me ask you a real quick question there. You used the word thinking. Weren't they promised by Obama that they were going to get these people and he was going to give them reinsurance money to make sure that they made a good return on their investment?
I was getting that. But first, remember, all the leaders came out, all the leaders of the healthcare industry at that point, who, by the way, every one of whom has been replaced since ACA came into effect, or Obamacare. They thought there'd be millions, and they actually did that. However, two insurance companies, two of the biggest, in their confidential real numbers world, realized that it wouldn't work. And what's happened? Well, young people who think they're immortal are just saying, I'll pay the fine if they catch me. More importantly, the provisions of it, of the ACA Act, allowed them to stay on their parents' policy to age 28. All right, so you have less and less people than everybody thought. Then the final straw, well, as you mentioned, President Obama promised the various insurance companies that they would get monies if they fell short. Well, his administration is now doling out $1 out of every 10 that under the original pact, these insurance companies. So instead of getting $10 million or $100 million, they're getting $1 million from the government. And the tax that you and I pay on every healthcare policy that whether it's individual or uh, from an employer. Now, the last thing is he set up, I'm going to say President Obama, because this is one of the things he requested, 23 cooperatives to provide insurance in various states, uh, quote, low cost insurance, cooperative insurance to people of lower income and to provide, quote, competition. What's the reason?
Don, why don't you explain to the audience who may not understand what a cooperative insurance situation is? Can you break it down into English?
In simplest words, it's supposed to be a non-profit where you pour all the monies in, and it's a cooperative rather than a for-profit corporation.
So it's like an agricultural cooperative where the farmers pool their crops and split the profits.
No. This is they call it a cooperative. It's where it's designed not to be a profit maker, but to come out even with a reserve.
Break even. Okay.
Okay. But they called it a cooperative.
Okay.
Because it sounded better. As one. But what happened? There were 23 of them, and last week, 7 of them went bankrupt. Now, how many are left? Now, there's one of these cooperatives that actually has made money over these years. 4 who are millions of dollars in default, and the rest are gone, in bankruptcy or simply stopped. So what do we have? We have Obamacare on its last legs, and we have a president saying it's working. Now, you brought up an issue when we were talking earlier about what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to make people who did not have health insurance have health insurance. And they claimed up to 42 million Americans were without health insurance.
Right.
Well, I was wrong on every figure I gave you. The official figure is 37 million Americans are still without health insurance. So, what do we have? We have a mess. Billions and billions of dollars wasted on a health system. Oh, and President Obama said, as you famously recalled, if you like your doctor and you like your health insurance, you can keep them. Well, I got news for you. You can't. And what's more, he said that the cost of health procedures, etc., the rising costs would be cut. Well, it did last year in 2015, but it's on course this year to be at double or 4 to 5% what it was 2 years from now. What do we have? We have problems in River City, and they ain't going to go away. That's my thought.
Okay. Well, but let's try and in the time we have remaining, let's just take a quick look at that. Your analysis is correct as far as you went. Where you didn't go was that the president never intended it to work anyway. The president used this all as a ruse, this wasting of trillions and trillions of dollars to get to universal single-payer health care, the U.S. government. And it's not going to happen on his watch, but based on what you're telling me, the dire straits of the insurance industry, they're going to put a lot of pressure on Congress to do something. And so that the Republicans who are talking about replace and repair Obamacare are going to be faced with the challenge: do they give up on Obamacare totally, or do they look at it and say, wait a minute, if we're going to scrap it, why don't we just scrap it for universal health care?
Well, you asked me that question earlier when we were talking, and it's a darn good question. And I'll tell you something. This year, 20 million Americans will have health savings accounts. I think you have one, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Dan?
Yes.
Okay. Essentially, HSAs enable you to take money from your salaries, from your taxable income, and sock it away, depending on where it is, from anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 per person or family, etc. We won't go into. But the point is, you're not taxed when you slot it into your HSAs. You're not taxed during they're in the HSAs, and you're not taxed when you spend it on medical, which is what most people do in old age.
Mm-hmm.
Well, HSAs and their ilk are probably going to be the way for the next 20 years, because as insurance companies have shown in study after study, HSAs make them profitable.
Okay.
Much more profitable. And if you can extend that to the rest of the country, you will have a very healthy healthcare system.
With that, we need to take a break. This is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
Two guys from Verona. Remember, if it's important to you, it's important to us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
You know, Dan, at the Democratic Convention, they're certainly not talking about oil, but as we were talking earlier, I think you have a darn good idea, and I think the audience should hear about it.
Thank you, sir. Last week, and more than last week, from the very beginning, most of the Republican candidates for president have been talking about energy independence for the United States. It's good for our national security. It's good for our economy. And yet, what we have is, because of the price decline in February, down to about $26.50 a barrel, we have been shutting in wells. In fact, not only are we shutting in wells, the number of rigs that are being used to drill for oil and natural gas has declined dramatically. A year ago, there were about 2,100 rigs in the United States drilling for oil and natural gas. They got down to 425, and the most recent count I saw was about 465. Now, we have storage capacity at Cushing, Oklahoma. Cushing, Oklahoma is the storage point for crude oil to be delivered against commodity futures contracts. You can trade oil and natural gas on the Chicago Board of Trade, and you can take physical delivery of crude oil, and it's delivered from Cushing, Oklahoma. Cushing, Oklahoma has about 98% full, which means it's had very little storage capacity. Most of the other storage farms all over the United States are overflowing with crude oil. Now, it doesn't make sense to me, Don, that with all of the people being laid off in the oil business, and with wells being shut in, inventory at very high levels, we're importing 4 million barrels a day from around the world. $4 million, 4 million barrels a day from around the world. We import 800,000 barrels of crude oil a day from Mexico. 800,000. It seems to me, if we want to be energy independent, we already are. When all of our storage is full, and when we're shutting down thousands upon thousands of wells because they got no place to store it, why in the hell are we bringing in 4 million barrels a day from countries all over the world? So why don't we say, okay, starting January 1st, 2017, the United States will impose a tariff on all imported oil into the United States of $15 a barrel. That means if it's 43 today and it stays at that level, It'll be 43 plus 15, which means that the cost of importing crude oil from outside the United States, based on today's price, would be around $58 a barrel. Now, if the Saudi Arabia has told us that the reason why they and OPEC continue to pump at world record rates is they're trying to protect their market share, question becomes, will they continue to pump if they have to pay a $15 a barrel tariff for every gallon of oil that they import into the United States? I don't believe that Saudi Arabia can eat $15 a barrel for all the oil that they ship into the United States, because that means they would be selling it at a loss and they would still have to pay the tax. So if we got the tax, that's $6.5 billion of tariff based on a current run rate of 4 million barrels a day. If we stop that and start draining down the reserves in storage tanks and opening up the wells that are producing, we are going to be energy dependent. We're going to put people back to work, and we're going to be in charge of energy for our national security and for our economy. It also is going to give us a weapon. And Don mentioned this to me earlier. By doing what I'm suggesting, you are creating a weapon for the United States to use against terrorism, which I talk about, in fact, in my third book of the Brotherhood of the Red Nile, America Responds. We have to take the money away from the oil companies, oil countries, who are using that money to fund terrorist organizations. And so by putting more and more pressure on the OPEC nations who are losing money right now by the imposition of a tariff, and to those other countries who are not members of OPEC, a new tariff, it's going to have a significant impact on the oil industry in those nations. And we're going to be able to be energy independent. To be able to take that off the table and then let the American oil industry sell its oil in the world markets to compete, and its natural gas, against the Middle Eastern oil cartel, I think we can steal additional market share away from them, especially in Western Europe and in Japan and even in China. So I think we have an opportunity, not under this president, but under a new president who believes in energy independence and wants America to be totally energy independent. A tariff on imported oil will dry up that imported oil and start loosening up inventories and supplies and wells and putting people back to work in the United States. Don?
As usual, a lot. When you first broached this to me, it sounded like a good idea. It does sound like a good idea. However, the question becomes, what will the Saudis do? What will those oil countries? What will Venezuela do? What will Mexico do? You and I both know Mexico right now has got to up the ante on its own oil fields. It's simply its technology is not there. It's trying to get private corporations in. Venezuela is going to have to do something. I keep coming back to that because I'm convinced that country is a powder keg. And what really worries me is Saudi Arabia. I did a little checking, not too much, but I happen to know somebody in the oil industry who's been trading for almost 40 years. And he said the problem might be because of the existing contracts with the various American importers, where if the tariff is imposed, the importers will have to pay the tax, not the Saudis or any other exporters, and he asked me a question, which I'll ask you. I have an answer. How much would that translate to the average consumer in at the pump per gallon?
Well, that's an interesting question because those people who have contracts to buy crude oil, um, they have term what are called term contracts at a term price. So today, for example, contracts are being let in the high 30s, low 40s for 1 year, 3 year, 5 year. Now, it's interesting how those contracts that you're talking about, work. When crude oil, if you've got a $40 price contract and crude oil goes to $80, you want to find every way possible in hell to get out of that contract because you want to be able to sell your oil at twice of what you're contracted for. Conversely, if you've got a contract at 60 and oil's trading at 40, you don't want to let anybody out of the contract. I know this is going to sound crass, but so what? I mean, so the importers who have the contracts, we turn around to them and say, gee, you're the importers for Saudi Arabia oil. What if we give you an opportunity to become the exporter of American oil and compete with Saudi Arabia? So that we're giving them a market share that they don't currently have. You know, it was only last December that the Congress passed the legislation and the president signed it that allows America to export crude oil. We've been able to export finished product, but never the raw material. Now we have the ability to do that. So I understand that there are contracts out there, but if we're going to think about independence, energy independence, we've got to begin to plan for it because it doesn't happen overnight. And I think if we make a public announcement next January 20th with a new Republican president that we're going to add a tariff, and we might add an escalating tariff for imported oil, we create an opportunity. We're sending a message outside to the foreign oil ministers that we're headed towards. And when those contracts come up for renewal, my guess is the importers have no reason to import oil from Saudi Arabia because they're going to be able to export oil at a much cheaper price, and America's not going to have a need to buy it from Saudi Arabia, so the exporters or the importers are going to be out of business.
I hope you're right. I still like your idea. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I appreciate
Are we getting
that.
close? Are we getting close to the time?
Yes, sir. We need to say, I'm Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
And I want you to go to our website, two guys from Verona.com. And we're going to have a couple of guests over the next couple of weeks, which are going to be really interesting. We'll try and get stuff posted on them as quickly as possible. We'll be right back after these messages.
You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. In this final segment, Don and Dan offer their predictions on what's going to happen in our world.
Well, Dan, I'll take the first shot. And first, I want to talk about Michael Goodwin. He's a columnist for the New York Post, and he also contributes to Fox News. And, you know, it's easy when someone's deposed, as Roger Ailes was last week, to pile on. But Michael Goodwin wrote a column that appeared today thanking Roger Ailes and saying, I don't know what he did but he helped me at a time when I needed it. I want to thank him. We don't see that much anymore. We certainly don't see it in journalism anymore. I ran into a situation of someone who was a great loyalist who was unceremoniously dropped. David Roden of the Times announced today was his last column. He writes for Sports of the Times. Anyway, this brings me to what I wanted to talk about. What will happen if Donald Trump wins and how the media will play it? Well, as you asked me just a few seconds ago, the media will play it, and everything that Donald Trump and his children and his ex-wives and his wives do will be fair game. If you remember when Napoleon came back from exile um, the first time, the Paris newspaper said the criminal Napoleon landed in Marseille. Then when he moved 100 miles north, they said uh, uh, the general has moved closer to Paris. The next time it was the Grand Marshal. Then finally said the paper said the glorious Marshal has reached Paris. Well, I'm saying here the papers are going to be very unhappy. The paper and the national media are going to be very unhappy with Donald Trump, and it will make his life a living hell.
So let me ask you a question about that. Is the media, the mainstream media, which is what we're talking about? We're talking about ABC and CBS and NBC News and maybe CNN, although it's not anywhere near as big. Are those stations? Are they who have been and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, who have been outed, if you would, by this most recent batch of WikiLeaks emails? They've been outed as an organization that has corrupted their principles for a different objective, meaning that it's more important for them to get Hillary elected president than it is to tell the truth or report the whole story. Is there a possibility that the media, the outcome of this election, if Trump were to win, that the outcome of this election is, dare I say it, a conscience for the American mainstream media?
No, I don't think, because it's a collective groupthink. It's interesting that the ombudsman for the New York Times, in her column this Sunday, said whether it's true or not, the perception is the New York Times is helping Hillary Clinton win. That the New York Times is a liberal paper whose liberalism is in its editorials. She wrote that, and the comments that are coming in fast and furious will create a firestorm. The answer is, even if Trump wins and proves all of the pollsters wrong, they will still have the groupthink. Back to you, Dan.
Well, I'm thinking about that because I'm a student of history, and I go back after George Washington, and I look at the political campaigns and the role. There's a reason why newspapers throughout the country were called the Cincinnati Democrat or the Columbus Journal Democrat or the Republican or whatever. That the press, the printed press in this country, was politically biased, and yet it was known this is a Republican paper, this is a Democratic paper. So that bias has been in the printed media for decades, if not centuries, in the United States. Is it because of the advent of electronic media that somebody decided that the bias that the media has had for decades and centuries had to disappear, and the electronic media had to appear to be independent?
Well, if you're asking me that question, I have to disagree with you. Yes, the papers could be biased to one party or other, etc. But certainly for the 20th century and for the period I've been a newsman, it was said the editorials could say what they want. Reporters reported the news. Of course, you would have. There's a wonderful play called The Front Page,
Mm-hmm.
which you might have seen, which is absolutely the best newspaper story drama. But the point about it was, if there was corruption, the newspapers would go after it, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic machine, Tammany Hall or whatever. The one role newspapers played, which is that they were local. When New Jersey lost lost out with the Newark News, and I'm biased on this, but it's been backed up by other journalism professors. When the 19th largest paper in the country and the voice of the conscience in New Jersey, the New Jersey politics went to hell in a handbasket. As you know, you've managed to escape and now in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still here, and I ran into it today. Just how corrupt this state is, because it has no local watchdog.
Well,
it has no one.
I'm sorry for interrupting, sir, but we've got about 10 seconds. So I'm Dan Perkins.
And I'm Don Mazzella.
And we're the two guys from Verona. Listen to us next week when we'll have a special guest. Thanks for watching.